Hello and welcome to Just Keep Writing,
a podcast for writers.
By writers.
To keep you writing.
I'm Jenna.
I'm Shingai.
I'm Sameem.
And I'm Nick.
We don't have Will today, so we can't.
Got to keep the last
substitute.
person tradition, right?
Yeah. Cool. Well, welcome everyone. Today we have a special guest, Tanvir Ahmed. I'm going to read his formal bio, and then we'll get to talking in a second. But Tanvir Ahmed's short fiction has been featured on Locus Magazine's recommended reading list and in the year's best fantasy. And his nonfiction has been longlisted for the British Science Fiction Association's annual award, and he demands a ceasefire now. Tanvir, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. I'm glad to be talking with you. Thank you for having me on your program.
I'm not usually the moderator, so I'm going to experiment with how this works. But there's a couple of things that I think I'm excited to talk about today. I think there's a lot of themes that I think come up in some of the things I've seen that you write about that I'm excited to discuss. So I'm just going to jump in unless, oh no, wait. There's something that we always ask, I guess, on the show. And it's, what are 3 words that describe what keeps you writing?
So I knew this question was coming at me because of listening to the show previously. And I was thinking about it a lot. And at first I had this sort of instinctive reaction of being like, why 3? Brain works in dualities. Like, I don't know whether it's just spending all this time with like Persian and Arabic, but like dualities seem better, like some sort of opposite that like I can kind of put myself into, but it's like, no, they want 3. Okay. So I had to think about what to say when you were inadvertently going to ask me about that. I gave this talk in January of, I want to say, 24. And the entire conceit for that talk was about a Persian prefix called hum. And so this is a word that in not just Persian, but in a ton of other regional languages will kind of be put onto other words in order to make a description, right? So like an example would be the word for road is ra. And if you put amra, if you put hum before ra, then you get amra, which kind of means together. It means on the same road, right? So then it takes on that meaning. So I'm going to try to have the mathematical average of your question and my instinct and go with 1 prefix, but like 3 words, right? So if I can give the words in Persian, then I have a ton of options with hum. I think this answer would vary from day to day. Today, my answer would be, because Jenna is here, my answer would be, the first word is hamdard, which means the same pain. It means to have sympathy. Hamdil, which means the same heart, which means unity. And I think maybe hamgham, which means the same sorrow. So it also along the lines of sympathy, but a different flavor to it from hamdard.
How do these keep you writing?
I think that the difficulty of writing so much of this stuff in English, sitting here doing it in the middle of, I started publishing in the war on terror. We are still deep in the war on terror. And now we are in the middle of Israel's genocide of Palestinians. And I think some of this keeps me writing because one has to achieve a sort of perspectival shift if you're doing things in the kind of common idiom of an empire that's responsible for this kind of brutality. You don't want to be writing about things, right? That's fundamentally, I think, the perspective that delineates a certain tenor of Orientalist writing. It's the thing that makes it possible to write about. And it would be so easy in some cases to simply write about a thing, monetize it, or make a career out of it, and you live your comfortable life. And meanwhile, other people are having bombs dropped on their head. And I want to cultivate an ethos for myself, but also I would argue it's critical for the field to stop thinking about writing about things and to think about writing with things, right? So the fact of this prefix being being with, I think it's this constant kind of reminder to myself that we should be very on guard whenever writing or speaking, not to do the about thing and to try and kind of bring ourselves into conversation, to not create that sort of fundamental separation on which so much of Orientalist narrative relies.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. That's a really beautiful way to put things in perspective. And I think we talk about this a lot on this show around how important community is for writing. And I think we talk a lot about in the perspective of for keeping us going from like a writing career and skills perspective. But I think it's also super important in terms of like being in community with your audience as well. It's not something that we get a chance to talk about as much, maybe because sometimes the audiences feel so hypothetical that we don't even stop to think about it. But it is a conversation with your reader about, I guess I shouldn't say about, but in relation to specific things. Nick, you wanted to say something?
You kind of hit it already. So I was going to, obviously, I don't speak the language or anything like that, but I do appreciate the explanation of the prefix and stuff like that. But seeing the commonalities between the words there and things like that, I wanted to talk about, like, it's very community minded and things like that, which I think is super important and kind of what you're saying and speaking about today.
Sorry, Jenna, were you saying something?
No, I was just taking a breath and I was thinking about, but now I'm going to say something because I'm already talking. I guess I'm thinking about being with, particularly in the ways that you laid it out, of feeling specifically, right? Pain, or the same pain, the same heart, same sorrow. They're being with in a way of connecting through feeling and embodiment, in a way that I think sometimes writing can distance us from bodies and from feeling. I don't know, there's a way of thinking about characters that is like playthings or toys to do things with, and then there's a way of thinking about characters that is deeply felt and embodied people that are going through really difficult things and connecting across difference in that way. I don't know where I'm going with this other than appreciating the level of deep connection there, as opposed to a sort of extractivist mindset when it comes to experiences and pain, particularly.
Yeah, if I can jump in on this. I think that I appreciate the angle about reaching out towards the community and a readership, and I think that is there. That's a hope, at least, right? Because I'm not really online. I don't have social media. I don't have a good sense for who reads what when it comes to my stuff, at least, at the current moment. But the other part of this, and this is tied into the reason why, like, maybe we're choosing things like Hamdard and Hamram today, is that it's not just a conversation with people who are alive. It is a conversation with the dead, because there are so many dead. We are constantly living with them, right? And we live in this amnesiac bubble that doesn't want to acknowledge 170,000 dead Afghans prior to the present moment, hundreds of thousands of dead Iraqis, like, prior to the present moment, not to mention like centuries of colonial violence prior to the present moment. And we keep kind of moving forward with a market machine that produces a narrative that doesn't necessarily think about that, right? So like the witness is, for me, also about trying to write with the people who are no longer here. And And I think that there's another hum word. There's ham awaz, right? It means the same voice. And I didn't choose that one when you asked about the three words because I'm angry. I don't feel that we've had the same voice in the science fiction and fantasy community. I don't feel like we've had a united voice about Palestine and Palestinian life and dignity. And that one's a hard one for me to kind of come to, but it's far easier when I look at the craft level of writing a story, because there are bits and pieces of language there that are not mine. There are things that were tropified over centuries in Persian, in other languages, that may have started off as one person using it, but they've just kind of broken off and become part of the narrative stream of what it means to speak these languages, these kind of images and metaphors and little bits of language that I've then kind of lifted out of something medieval, put that into English, and then grafted onto a piece that I'm trying to publish in the 21st century. And that might be another form of hamawazi, of same voiceness, like writing with that voice or with those voices from the past. Those are also the dead, right? So that's also a technique of, I think, expanding that community angle that you're talking about. It's not just about who is here right now, who has the ability to talk, but also kind of first and foremost reminding ourselves about how many people have, not just they cannot talk because they are not here, but they have been robbed of the ability to talk because they've been killed, right? So I think that also has to factor into the community angle.
Yeah, 100%. Shingai?
There's so much that's so powerful about what you've just shared, Tanvir. And one of the things that I'm reminded of is Nur Hindi's poem, Fuck Your Lecture on Craft, My People Are Dying, which is a poem that I've sat with a lot in the last year and taught. And like, there's a section where she says, I'm looking up the poem now. There are two sections. I tell you about children throwing rocks at Israeli tanks seconds before becoming daisies. And that section for me is like, you're in conversation with the children who are throwing rocks, and you're in conversation with the children who have become daisies. So just being in conversation with those who have transitioned. And then I pick flowers for my dead father when I'm sad. He watches Al Jazeera all day. And just this image of a father who is dead, who is passed, but who is living and watching Al Jazeera all day. I guess one of the things, this is also bringing up for me Christina Sharp, who is a Black academic writer who thinks about grief and Black history, and like how you write with the knowing that so much death is happening around you all the time. And my question here, I guess, is where, if there is a separation between you who is living and those who have passed, like what does it look like to write from you and write with those who are no longer here?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for the comments.
Yeah.
Thank you. They're really important. I think I don't do well answering in the abstract, so I'll tell a story, and maybe that'll be an answer, okay? So one time I was in Tashkent. I was working at the Beruni Research Institute in their archives kind of for a few weeks, and a few weeks into it, came across this one manuscript from, I want to say, the 14th century, maybe the 15th century. Cannot remember exactly, so forgive me for that. But came across this manuscript that was a relatively dry kind of legal text on various minutiae of Islamic law. It was exceedingly boring for me. This is nothing that I wanted to read. But what was really interesting about it was that on the cover page, simply because it happened to be paper and it was being passed around in the region a few centuries back, somebody had scrawled a question about On Fridays, I heard this thing that if one walks by the graveyard, the dead are more likely to hear you. Okay. So that's there. The manuscript clearly had been through different hands. A little bit under that, in a different hand, somebody had written, actually, this is what this famous figure named Sohrawardi had to say about the spirits of the dead. It's not just that one passes by the graveyard, it's that they will actually enter the home. They return to earth and they come back to home on Friday. So the whole walking by the graveyard thing is incomplete. And then somebody else had scrawled a note being like, no, I'm not sure about this. The dead are actually accessible in this way only. And there's this whole kind of argument playing out over different centuries. It's very likely that the people who are scrawling these notes to each other, they did not meet each other, right? If they had met each other, they would be having that conversation, right? This is actually a conversation between people who are passing on through time, and they're just kind of circulating the text. The text itself is there for kind of mundane purposes in order to teach a beleaguered kind of lawyer or jurist what to do with kind of annoying procedural nitty-gritty about divorce law in 15th century Bukhara Sharif, right? But then this conversation about death and accessing death is kind of happening in the margins. Now is the point when I would look at other texts from this period, and at the end, there would be kind of these invocations from the scribes copying these words, saying like, I'm writing in this city, may God protect it from calamities. And like, if you're reading this, please say a prayer for me. I tried to do something good by copying this whole manuscript down for you and giving you that use. So they're talking to you constantly in this sort of daily practice. And then there are moments where I remember coming across one where a scribe he had written, I'm writing this in the city of Kashgar, Harasallahu min al-afat, may God protect it from calamities. And I felt the break because I know what is happening in Kashgar right now. We all know what is happening with the Uyghur genocide, and it is not protected from calamities. So I think this is a very long-winded way of getting at an answer to your question, and perhaps it's not a very good answer, but I think that it is these constant interruptions and trying to not only be sensitive to the interruptions, but also understand the kind of aspirations that they're laden with, right? Like, people had dreamed of a world that was not this one. And there is a sort of moment where when I encounter these, one feels at times that sense of duty. Like, okay, one can try to do whatever they can from their corner to bend the arc of history back, or at least do your part to try and make it different than what it is that we see right now. Does that make sense?
There's so much there. My brain went in a million different directions. Thank you so much.
No, I one of my dear friends, he and I talk about this all the time, that when we were sitting in like basic theory classes, I didn't know one word of Foucault or Derrida or any of these things, but I would be the one that kind of like raised my hand. I'm fairly sure that this is what happened to Abu Nawas when he was an apprentice poet, like in this city, and maybe that is pertinent. And it can be a long-winded kind of tangent at times. So I hope I'm not derailing us over much.
No, it's fun to listen to.
No, and one of the main things that come up for me with that is, I have a friend who doesn't have an active, like a spiritual practice of sorts that would be recognized as a spiritual practice. But one of the things that he says, he's an academic, and like he thinks about revolutionaries, reading the revolutionaries as speaking to the dead, as like listening to the dead, and like what you're saying about the writers who in the margins are directly speaking to you. It does feel like ancestral communication. Yeah. And Jenna has had a question for a second.
Oh, I just want to jump in, I guess, because I'm also thinking about the way that listening to the dead is a lesson in speaking to generations to come as well. So it's a time travel. It's a folding of time in multiple directions, right? Because there's a practice of speaking with the dead that is also simultaneously, as you are writing, a speaking to generations to come. And then one of the things, and I'd love to hear you talk more about that and how those are enfolded. But then I'm also thinking about Shingai, the poem that you shared, the children becoming daisies, and these people writing to protect spaces from calamities, and thinking about how I guess I've been thinking recently, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this as well about how speaking with the dead is also speaking with the land, and how, I don't know if that's something also. that's it. That's close as a question as I can get right now. There's something about speaking with the dead that is also speaking with the land, that is also speaking with the future.
So I can say two things about this, actually. One, I think the speaking to the future thing is wrapped up in the fact of, at least again, when one encounters the physical evidence of the dead, at least in my day job, like I work as a historian, I work on things medieval in the Islamic world, I work on culture and society, and you come across expressions of, these are my hopes for the future. And then you come across expressions of, please pray for me, right? Like, and that kind of simple ask, I think, shows at least some form of directionality. Somebody is asking you to respond when you have come across their words or their work, even if it is not actually their words. And if they've called on you, then it is your choice whether you choose to answer or you choose not to. I think this goes back to my kind of, I have this bugbear about what Orientalist writing looks like. I think it comes down to another iteration of my argument there, that there are many people who choose not to answer. And whether or not we're consciously doing it, it is a choice, right? And so I think then the key is to actually become conscious of whether or not we are responding when we are called upon to do so. And then one has to ask how. When it comes to the land, it happens all around us. And again, this comes to the amnesia point that, again, I'm not going to be able to do this in an abstract way. So I will tell another story. So back during the first Trump presidency, the American military dropped what's called the mother of all bombs near Achin in Nangarhar province, right? And it's the largest non-nuclear bomb that is in the US military arsenal, I believe. It's dropped years later, and there's very good literature on this. Lindsay Billing actually has done very in-depth investigative research on this in Afghanistan after, I think, 2021. And I can share this kind of material with you if you would like to include it in your list of materials for the podcast. But there's been a lot of study done about what is the effect of the bomb on the land, right? Like what the people who are living on it, what kind of sicknesses and diseases actually have shown up. And expanding out from there, what happened to Afghans because of burn pits? What happened to Afghans because of sewage dumps in Afghanistan's rivers, right? All of these things are things that people are living with because of a war that created so much death. And now, even after the formal end of that war, there are no bombs being dropped, but the land has changed, right? Groundwater, which the city of Kabul relies upon, groundwater reserves have been reduced to such a degree that the Kabul River, if you look at recent pictures of the stream, like it's dried to this terrifying extent. There are projections saying that the entire city will be out of water by 2030. And this is a city that is hundreds of years old. And after this war, after this violence, it's facing an existential threat because the land has transformed, the water is gone, that kind of thing, right? And we're witnessing the same thing unfolding in Palestine, where there are how many kilograms, dozens of kilograms of lead tonnage and contamination for every square acre in Gaza. There are matters to which the transformation of the land and all of this killing that we're seeing all around us. And like these two things are the same, right? Like they're processes that are going hand in hand the entire time. We're here to talk about these things as writers, right? So like, what is the job from our perspective? That's where remembrance and kind of pushing back against the amnesia about this continuously happening again and again and again becomes important. Like you have to marshal and leverage language against that amnesia. And that's what I think that as a market, we're not doing, right? We haven't been doing it. We didn't do it throughout the war on terror. And now we're repeating the same vicious cycle yet again.
I mean, this kind of leads me into a sort of anecdote that will become a question. And actually, I was scratching my head about something that I ran into recently. I was at a local con, and there was a panel that was called Uses of History. And something about the title of the panel right away, I was like, oh no, I have to go to this and I'm going to be troubled. And there was a lot of good commentary in it. And I appreciated some of the panelists' comments in general. But there was this repeated use by a few of the panelists of the phrase mining history for story ideas. And I was like, why is this? I couldn't articulate why it was rubbing me the wrong way. And I think this discussion is answering my question, is that it was so one directional and not relational at all, not in conversation with. And I'm so glad you brought this up, because I now have the answer to my question about like why it was bothering me. And it sort of led me to ask, and during the Q&A, how do these authors that were on the panel deal with writing about times and places where, or how do they ensure that their sources are broad and that they aren't inheriting the biases of their sources into their writing and perpetuating them downstream? There's a great answer by the author Nicole Glover talking about reading widely, but also not relying solely on traditional academic sources, because for a lot of communities, there aren't any, or they're not going to answer the questions. But I was curious from your perspective, especially for some of the works that you discussed in your Strange Horizons essay, how often do you think that these authors are just relying on very narrow sources and carrying their biases forward versus are explicitly trying to push these biases forward? Or is it some mix of the both?
That's a really tricky question. I think it's a really good question, and it's a really tricky one to answer. Because what we have are their performances, right? Like we don't have a sincere record of intention, but they are sincere productions. And I think that there are two ways to approach that. I think the first, going to kind of your instinct at that panel, which I think like it's, yeah, like that's definitely one of those manifestations of an extractive mentality. What do you do with a mine? Part of the issue there is that history is presumed to actually just be this object. Like it objectively exists. There is such a thing as a history, and we all can kind of go into it and mine it. That's not how history works, right? I mean, history is something that we are constantly in the process of kind of creating and recreating and refashioning, depending on what we have learned and unlearned throughout time. It is a conversation between us and those sources. So I think that the critique has to be waged on two fronts. Like one cannot actually presume that we are capable as a field, if we can call like SFF writing a field, like we are not capable of just going out and like dealing with history, and then you can kind of grab something from that foreign country over there called history, and then you can bring it back to your table and then do something with it. Like it's not how we deal with it, right? Like we're constantly in the process of creating it, and we have to counter create oftentimes because of how power dynamics shape what history is presumed to be. And I think that leads into the second part of your question, right? Like the fact of how somebody like Howard, or how, Glenn Cook's book, or how Guy Gabriel Cave's book operates in the market is, to me, more significant than whether or not they really hate Muslim people and like we're trying to say it. Like, the hatred actually is a tangible, material, measurable, quantifiable thing. We can see it on a page. So whether or not the intention, because it's very easy for somebody to say, oh no, I don't hate Muslim people, I eat couscous. Like, fine, okay, one can say these things, but the effect is still the same. It doesn't actually do anything about what narrative we have been presented with. So when one is reading these academic material or non-academic material, sometimes it's deeply polemical material, and they're kind of pulling out from there and pushing this stuff up. Like, Howard has moments where I will read passages from, or entire stories from him, and I kind of know that he read these things in the gazetteer literature that was produced across South Asia during the British colonial period, because like the references are kind of obvious, and it would make sense that this is where he's getting it from. He reads colonial propaganda and colonial literature and kind of inputs it in for his own stories. Then you have people who kind of leave receipts and bibliographies, and they kind of point out what academic literature they have been reading, and there are problems over there. But I think that the chief kind of answer that I have to a lot of that problem is that it's not a problem that can be easily addressed if you simply leave the same actors in play who control the narrative market. Like, we are dealing with a market, and unless you get people from the agenting level, the editing level, the marketing level, the author level, like, to come from different backgrounds and operate in the market, nothing is going to change.
Thanks. Yeah, Nick?
Yeah, so I want to bring up another phrase that I hear. I've heard a lot from my end and things like that kind of goes along with like mining from history. And I just want to know kind of like your thoughts and kind of group discussion, right? I've heard the phrase a lot. History is written by the victor. And when you talk about mining history, it goes back into what you're saying is like, what kind of narrative do we have? What are we getting? Like, and I'm glad you touched on the propaganda spot, because that's what I see from that. And kind of like, what are your thoughts on that type of phrase, and how is that something that you can kind of combat and make sure you're not just pulling from one side when you're trying to do your research in these types of things?
First and foremost, I think the most important thing to do is to actually talk to people for whom that history is their history, right? One must actually speak. Like, if you're going to be dealing with material that touches on a history that matters to others, try and figure out how other people actually take that history, right? So if you're going to, let's use Howard, because he is gone and extremely atrocious. So, I mean, I feel bad going after somebody who is gone, but not really that bad, because Lord, he was extremely
Tanvir,
toxic.
I think it's just another way of speaking with the dead, really, is what you're doing here.
Yeah,
you're
but sometimes one
responding to a call. Yes. Yeah, well, his call has been put out very clearly. You're just responding to the call. It's a different call than the Pray For Me ones.
Yeah. It's a very good point, right? Like, the dead are not necessarily nice people. Like, the dead can be like right assholes. So yeah. So I think that when it comes to something like Howard, right? History is written by the victors, sure, but it's also written by people who are kind of living under that victory, right? The sources that somebody like Howard might have been drawing on in order to write his version of like what he calls Afghanistan, those are going to be British sources. There are going to be American sources. There are a couple of American kind of adventurers that wander around the region starting in the 19th century. He's pulling from that literature. If one was so inclined, I think the answer to that would have been to actually just find what do Afghans say about the exact same kind of period in literature, and then can we publish an Afghan author? Can we publish somebody who, can present history and present stories about that history from a different perspective. I'll give you kind of one example that is a story collected in the mid 20th century, but it's a recollection amongst Afghans about the first British invasion and conquest of Afghanistan in 1839, right? So the British army kind of shows up, they conquer these cities, they drive out the existing kings. And then as they're pillaging and burning and moving through the countryside, they come across this tree. And the tree happens to be built over the grave of a local saint in that village. And the British army decides that they're going to cut down the tree. They take their axes, they kind of start chopping at it. All the axe heads kind of mysteriously break. British commanders get angry. They throw ropes at the tree and kind of lash them to various animals that they brought with them. But the animals are straining. They can't do anything about it, right? Finally, the British get angry. They set fire to the tree, but the branches are just not catching fire in the same way. And they're very frustrated. And ultimately, even though they have kind of concluded their conquest, they leave. And the tree is still kind of there. And then the stories about the tree are being told many decades after the war itself. So I think that I'm telling that story because this kind of phrase of history is written by the victors is also continuously being challenged, right? The idea that they have the ability to kind of impose a totalizing narrative, that too is not true. If one is sensitive to it, you can kind of see, one could call it kind of ephemeral evidence, or one could call it hauntings or spectral histories. There are different ways in which you can conceptualize it, but there are other narratives constantly floating around at the edges of even what looks like a totalizing conquest. And I think that the task is then to be responsive to those narratives instead of simply engaging with the easiest to access, which is usually the thing that one would find written by the victors.
Yeah. So it sounds like part of repeating the phrase history is written by the victors also shuts down the possibility of, or the impetus to, or necessity of looking and paying attention to all of the narratives, that the counter narratives that are there, have always been there, continue to be there. There's a way in which that kind of relieves the responsibility of looking for them, almost. Maybe.
I mean, it relieves the responsibility if you assume that the responsibility is felt in the first place.
Oh, I guess so. Okay, so you need to even be aware.
I'm not convinced. Yeah, I'm not to answer, I think, Sameem's question. Like, I can't make a statement about authorial intent, and I will stand by my kind of blasé evasion of saying I don't quite care and it doesn't matter to me. But to be a little bit real about it, yeah, I'm very not convinced that people are actually looking to write a responsible history or to ask these sorts of questions. I don't think that it would occur to many authors, right? In the same way that there are things that will not occur to me that in a couple hundred years, somebody would be like, well, this Tanvir guy really missed a number of important things that I should have been paying attention to.
On that topic, I have another question about an author whose intent I think you can answer, your own. I'm curious if in any of your works, or whether they're published or works in progress, you prefer to take tropes that have been sort of very widespread and play with them and recast them and challenge them directly, or do you prefer to not acknowledge those at all and just not even have them, those racist, Islamophobic tropes, be part of the conversation at all? Or is it both?
That's a really good question. Yeah, and it's a method question, not an intent question, which makes me happy. And I think that on the method level, there's no escaping the second one, right? By dint of the fact that we're writing in English at this time in the Anglophone world. So, as far as I understand it, the majority of Anglophone science fiction and fantasy is run out of the United States right now. It's the largest kind of market shareholder, so to speak, for a lot of the things that I end up reading. I think the fact of operating in that world, even though we have, I think, substantial now openings and breaks in that apparatus, the fact of operating in English during this time, I think, necessarily means that one is tangling and wrestling with tropes, like, and negative tropes, things that you would perhaps be hoping not to write with or think with, but one has to address it. Like, I will tell another story. Okay. I find that oftentimes writing any of the works that have been published, these kind of depictions of rebellion or violence, uprisings, they kind of show up, right? That's not a fact of me being particularly sensitive to materials from the past. That's not being separated out from kind of coming up in the war on terror in the United States. And that is very much, I think, a part of what that means to me, and the sort of either lizard brain drive towards including this material and grafting it on to other stuff that I might come across, or sometimes a very purposeful attempt at doing so, right? Like, there are definitely images and codes and ideas that I tend to move around in my stories that have everything to do with security states and drone warfare and the staggering death toll of the war on terror. And I think that there's a sort of fantasy of freedom that we would be able to kind of separate ourselves out from all of that, which I understand why that is compelling. I understand why that would be attractive. I've been attracted to that myself, but I'm not yet convinced that, given where we are and how we operate, that degree of complete remove is possible. And I'm not sure that it's desirable, because I'm not sure that isn't the sort of purifying impulse that we often see on the other side of things, that sort of desire to have a stripped away, clean, pure narrative that isn't tainted by the moral sins of like the other or the foreigner. Like it or not, we are all complicit in each other by this point, right? Afghan history is American history, right? Pakistani history, because of what happens with American air campaigns, that is now part of American history too. Like, these things are wound together, and we try to forget that they are. And I don't think that that's desirable. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I really like that answer, actually. And I think it's a good like reminder of our shared histories, and that it is, regardless of your intent in writing, it is better to account for them than to pretend they don't exist. Shingai?
One of the things that came up for me while you were talking was I feel like I've been in a poetry space. So I'm thinking about Audre Lorde's poem, A Litany for Survival, where she says, for those of us who are on the shoreline, and she talks about like writing from the margins and what it is to know that we are speaking knowing that we were never meant to survive. And also the conversation around the victor telling the story makes me think about what you were saying earlier about the market and who is controlling the market, right? And I'm thinking about, for those people who are writing in the margins of the market, writing a history that is not to the white supremacist imagination that has made so much of the world what it is today. How do you come to terms with the fact that, as you talk about in your essay, language is limited? And this is something that I've been struggling with in my own work, and just thinking about like, if you're working to get published, then you are playing within the confines of this publication market, white supremacist imagination, which has informed so much of what the market has become. And as much as you are critiquing it, you are still working within it. And so there's like the desire to completely dismantle it. And then I think about the filmmaker Osman Sembene, who says, like, there's this interview that he did where he was being asked about his audience, and he said, Europe is not my center, you know? And so when you're completely decentering, I guess I'm struggling even with the idea of decolonization still working within the framework of academia that is deeply colonized. So, like, how do you dismantle? How do you decolonize? How do you work against while working within? Is my question, is something that's been coming up for me throughout this whole conversation.
Yeah, I feel what you are saying in my heart. Like,
Yeah.
I am very glad that you brought up all of those examples, right? Because I think these are the things that we are now kind of, it's not a new struggle necessarily. Like, as you've mentioned, like, these are thoughts that have been kind of happening for decades. In so much as we have been participating in this, or people from like the margins, as you say, have been participating, the question has kind of repeatedly arisen. And I think the fact that there has been no good answer kind of leads into the second part of what you were alluding to. Like, it's fine and well to speak about decoloniality all as much as you want, but unless there is actual, like, quantifiable material change in the way that these monetized systems work, who is getting access to what, and how we are able to put pressure on a mechanism of supremacy and dominance that leads us to all manner of horrors, right? Like, and I know I will keep coming back to this one. I will keep coming back to this one forever, but genocide. I mean, we are not in a place where our market is somehow divorced or separated out from the genocide of Palestinians.
This is actually specifically what I wanted to ask about too, in connection with what Shingai is asking, is like, how do we advocate on behalf of Palestinians now? What do we do as a system, or as a like sci-fi community, like with it working within the structures that we have? What, you know, there's so much more that we can be doing. Sorry, what can we do also?
Yeah, I mean, in my view, we do everything that we possibly can, and that can break down differently on an individual level. But Jenna, would you mind if I like briefly share at least a sketch of how it is that we met, right?
Go for it.
So Jenna and I never knew each other in person. We had come across each other on the internet, but we were basically invited to an event and we were offered some money to be there. We did not quite realize what the event was going to be like. Very quickly, separately. I think this was in spring of 24, I want to say.
During Ramadan as well.
I was very grumpy. Yeah, no, I was very hungry and very grumpy, and then quickly realizing that there was no way that we could be here because of our commitments to Palestine. And I didn't know Jenna. Jenna didn't know me, but I got the sense from how she spoke about other things that I had an idea of where her politics lie. And I think that's actually what I said to you when we were leaving the event, that, hey, can we talk? I think I know how you feel about things. This is how I feel about things. And we stood outside and we discussed what the event was and the fact that as people who support the Palestinian cause, we had to walk away. And we did. And I'm kind of bringing that back because I'm fairly sure that we would have done so separately. But the fact that we did so together meant that in all the community work that Jenna has done on ground over here since, in which, you know, she's been incredibly generous and kind of brought me into those spaces, then there are moments where I get to kind of double our voice and work differently to bring Palestine and Palestinian work to the center. There was a moment where Jenna had organized an event where we were to exchange books and kind of talk about them a little bit. And I had ordered the translation of Ibtisam Azam's The Book of Disappearance. And because I wanted to order it from a local bookstore, it did not get here nearly in time for the event itself. So I kind of showed up feeling quite badly. But I knew that Strange Horizons had put out that special issue in 2021 with Palestinian fiction. I knew of other authors and other forums who had their fiction online. And it was the work of those editors who kind of recognized Palestinian voices and felt that it was important that they could put up everything from, nonfiction, things like Fargo Tabakhi's Notes on Craft to, entire compilations that had kind of come out in print. And so we were able to kind of put up a list of these things and come up with it on the spot and kind of pin it up on the wall and talk about this stuff for a while with the rest of the guests. This is one example. It is not a particularly stirring one. I'm not giving it because I think that we did something, right? I'm giving it because I think that it's a good illustration of the fact that as a community, it takes a combination of things. It takes editors who were willing to publish Palestinian fiction in the first place and make that available. It takes people being able to kind of recognize political commitment on the fly and be able to voice that, even when one is under threat, and kind of come together in that moment. And then it takes a sort of understanding of collaboration and what it would do to kind of constantly and ceaselessly be talking about Palestine in the moment. And all of that is kind of necessary at every single step of the journey. Does that kind of answer the question?
Yeah, I was just making sure that we were talking more explicitly about what we can do as a community and
the
together.
number one thing, the number one thing, that's on the method side of things, right? But right now, the number one thing is to also figure out how one can materially support Palestine and materially support Palestinians. So there are organizations like Ta'awun that you might look at. There are good lists that have been put out of reliable GoFundMes. You can find these things floating around on the internet. I can share some with you if you would like. But I would urge you that the first and easiest thing to do would be to find Palestinians and talk to them and ask them what it is that you can do to help. Look around you and kind of engage with the people around you. That's always more important than something abstract.
I think we might be coming up. Oh, sorry, Shingai. Go ahead.
That's okay. I just wanted to, go off of that. In the realm of language, as a writer, and the limitedness of language, just building off of Jenna's question, I guess, what do you feel like there is a responsibility? And what is that responsibility in the realm of being a writer?
I absolutely feel like there is a responsibility.
Yeah.
I think it was Usman Malik, relatively early on, who kind of pointed out the fact that it's quite a wretched thing that science fiction and fantasy tends to valorize rebellion and resistance and all these underdog stories, and then all of a sudden everybody is completely mum when it comes to Palestinian life, right? And I do think that this is a generalization. There are very notable exceptions to the rule, and we've seen that over and over again. There are forums that are consistently talking about Palestine and that publish things that include Palestinian fiction. It's not a broad brush to say that the entirety of the world is one way. I think we have seen it. We've seen counterexamples. We've seen, for example, Vajra Chandrasekhara, when he speaks in any of the award ceremonies for his amazing work, he's constantly bringing up Palestine and material ways in which to offer support. We've, I think, seen a good amount of online activism where people are trying to bring attention to the genocide on a consistent basis and have been doing so from the beginning. I think that we I saw that, I think just yesterday on Strange Horizons, there's a kind of wrap up of 50 pieces across the last 25 years, because it is an anniversary. And there's Maria Haskins wrote about Palestinian fiction and kind of included different Palestinian authors in the special issue and then beyond it as well, right? So there are ways in which you see parts of our market reacting in exactly the right way. Part of the responsibility, I think, is twofold. One, make space, right? Like, it is first and foremost, the important thing is to make space for Palestinians. Like, in order to do that, Palestinians must be alive. So that is where doing every bit of advocacy that you can to call for a ceasefire and call for an end to the killing and call for an opening of the borders so food and aid can get inside, that is always deeply important. Then the work has to come to figuring out how to maybe sometimes get out of the way and bring other voices to the fore. And that's going to be a kind of continuous piece of work, because it's about, I'm kind of thinking of a phrase that I read in an interview from Professor Bashara Dumani, who is over at my alma mater. He was the president of Birzeit University for a time, and he's a Palestinian scholar who works on Palestinian history. And he noted in that interview that he said, for Palestinians to be free, the whole world would need to be free. And I think it is important to kind of see these things constantly connected, right? Like, we're not absolved of the struggle for emancipation and liberation at any given point, right? And we do need to see the way that the system is interconnected constantly. And whether or not, I think he kind of went on to talk about the fact that whether or not that sort of total freedom is achievable, it doesn't absolve you of the responsibility to constantly be fighting for it in all your work. So at the very least, I'm not asking everybody to kind of go out there and all of a sudden have the same voices writing about things that people are perhaps not qualified to write about. I think that the important part is to try to detect in your own work what are the mechanisms that are, whether unconsciously or consciously, participating in systems of supremacy and genocide. What are those mechanisms and how do you uproot them, right? It's just about that attention to your own craft. It has to begin from there. And after that, then there are so many individual factors that become important in figuring out what it is that you as an individual can do, that it has to be negotiated on a case-to-case basis, in my opinion.
Thank you for that awesome answer. I feel like we could talk about this for a whole other hour, but we just hit the hour mark. And I did want to give you a chance to call it anything that you have upcoming, or where folks can find you, and continue getting to know you and your work.
I have pieces that are scheduled to come out. So in October, in theory, I'll have a piece out in Kaleidotrope. That was the first piece that I had kind of sent out since October 23. And it is very much about the question of being a historian and writing this sort of these histories and drawing on that in the moment that we're living. And I have another piece contracted with the Horror Library that should be out somewhere in February 26th. And I don't think I can say too much about the novella because I don't have a firm date as to when that is coming out, but there is also a novella in the works. Then if I have more information about that soon, I will share it with you.
Awesome. Thank you for spending this hour with us and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.
Excited to see the upcoming work.
Thank you all.
And this has been Just Keep Writing, a podcast for writers, by writers, to keep you writing. You can find us at justkeepwriting.org. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Feel free to reach out to any of us on our social medias, and please jump in our Just Keep Writing Discord channel. Links to all of that is in the show notes. Lastly, please support our show by going to patreon.com/justkeepwriting. We offer daily writing prompts, early access to podcast episodes, and much more. Thanks for listening, and just keep writing.